Okay, this is the second lecture, and it deals with the main ideas of legal positivism. You will remember in the previous lecture we talked about the new questions that comes up as a result of the 17th century developments in Europe. So the question raised in this lecture is, how do the legal positivists answer the questions that we posed there? Some of them I won't be dealing with directly, but they are all kind of in there. So the first idea of legal positivism is that of the epistemological theory. I know this is a word that you have trouble pronouncing. Just say epistemological, it's not that hard. Okay. And the epistemological theory is basically a rejection of natural law. It's a rejection of the idea that there are rules of natural justice. And in simple terms, it says that knowledge of facts and knowledge of morals are established in different ways. So you cannot use the same way in which you establish moral rules to establish legal rules. And that's the essence of the epistemological theory. But it is more important to state what the legal positivists do not say than to ask, what do they say? And here is two quotes for you. The first one is from Professor Hart. And it says that they, and he's talking here about utilitarians, which preceded the legal positivists, they never denied that the development of legal systems had been powerfully influenced by moral opinion. Secondly, neither Bentham nor his followers denied that by explicit legal provisions, moral principles might at different points be brought into a legal system and form part of its rules, or that courts might be legally bound to decide in accordance with what they thought just or best. So it's not a simplistic idea of law and morality has nothing to do with one another. It's much more complicated than that. And then the second one is by myself. Differently put, the enterprise of saying what law is and is not should be kept separate from deciding whether the law is good or bad, just or unjust. And it is on the basis of these ideas that legal positivists would often say that judges are not in a position to decide whether something is a good law or a bad law, but they are in the position of saying, I will not apply this law. Yeah, it sounds strange, but there you go. Okay, so you could sum up a lot of the ideas of legal positivism in this quote from Professor Hart. And he says, surely if we have learned anything from the history of morals, it is that the thing to do with a moral quandary is not to hide it. So that's both a rejection of the idea in natural law that we can somehow know the right answer, that there are right answers to moral questions. So it's a rejection of that on the one hand, but it's also a rejection of the idea that we can pretend things are not moral questions when they are in fact moral questions. And this is something we will encounter again when we get to critical legal studies. The second main theory in legal positivism is the social theory. And this is, of course, a rejection of the divine right of kings. And as I said in the previous lecture, the problem, once you get rid of the divine right of kings to rule, is the question of what do you replace it with? And traditionally, in the 17th and 18th centuries, this was a dispute between two groups of people, represented by the two gentlemen in the picture here. On the left-hand side, you see John Locke, the English philosopher, and on the right-hand side, Thomas Hobbes, also an English philosopher. And as you know, both of them start with an idea of the state of nature. John Locke says, in the state of nature, everything is fantastic. Everyone lives in peace and harmony. It's only when we invent money and people get too much money that we get conflict. And to resolve that conflict, we create a state. But the thing to remember for John Locke is still that there are such things as natural rights and the natural law. And these rights you cannot give up. You have them simply because you're human. So what happens when the state is formed is we do not give up our rights. Our rights remain with us. We only give up the right to enforce those rights. So the job of the state is to enforce the rights, but they don't take away our rights. On the other hand, Thomas Hobbes, on the right-hand side, has the idea that, no, the state of nature is horrible. Everyone is fighting with everyone else the whole time. He says in his book Leviathan that life is nasty, brutish, and short in the state of nature. So his solution to that is to have a strong leader, to have someone who becomes the state, and we give up all our rights to that person or that institution, and that person or institution then protects us. So in essence, you give up your rights for the sake of being protected, for the sake of peace. And you will recognize both these positions in debates in Africa today still. On the one hand, the group that says, no, we have natural rights, and those rights are sometimes inscribed in a constitution, but you cannot get rid of them. They will always be there, and that's typical John Locke. He influenced the American Constitution, which starts with we the people, and his influence is also clear in our Constitution. And then Thomas Hobbes typically is the position in African dialogues about having a strong man in charge of the government, i.e. what we call a benevolent dictator that will ignore our rights, but who will at least ensure that there is peace and stability within the state. So those two opposite ideas comes from the 17th century, but it is still very much part of 21st century living. What does legal positivism say about this? Well, in essence, legal positivism is a reaction to this kind of debate, but not what you would expect. In the first place, they reject the idea of natural law and natural rights. So they reject Locke. There's a very famous quote by Bentham who said that natural rights is nonsense upon stilts. It's not just nonsense, it's nonsense on stilts. So they don't accept Locke's position. But they also reject the idea of an absolute ruler. So they also reject Hobbes. And this is part of the developments of the revolutions in the 17th century and even into the 18th century. So the idea that you must have some form of democracy, but that democratic idea cannot be based on natural rights or natural ideas. So, which brings you to the third theory, and that is the most troublesome theory in legal positivism, and that is the command thesis. The command thesis is the idea that law is a command from a sovereign to people who are in the habit of obeying it. And as you will have seen in your research for assignment 1, you will have seen that this causes a lot of problems and a lot of difference between the various legal philosophers. So it can be summarized in the following way, and that is that you get from Austin and Bentham the command theory of law, where the idea that it is a command and there is a sanction attached, i.e. if you don't obey the command, then you will be punished, and that is the main manifestation of law. And the problem with that theory is that it excludes private law, constitutional law, and international law, because private law is not a command. If you enter into a contract for marriage with someone, that's not a command. That's something you create yourself. And so there are two ways in which you can understand, which this is understood in legal positivism. The one is the one by heart, the idea of the rule of recognition, and that law must be normative, which you will have encountered in your studies. And the other one is the one by Kelsen, which is called the pure theory of law, and which we will talk about in the next lecture. But you can see, therefore, that while almost all of them agree with the first two parts of the definition of legal positivism, they do differ from one another when it comes to the command theory. Okay, so let's end then with a definition of legal positivism, and that is that legal positivism is the belief in a postulated code of conduct based upon social facts, adopted by authorized institutions and used as an instrument of control for the people of a state. So these are the very essential ideas of legal positivism summarized in this one definition. And when you look at legal positivism, or whether someone is a legal positivist, you have to make sure that these requirements are all